Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the return to normalcy on our channel with geopolitics and international relations. We have relaunched, moving our days away from the Sunday stream to now Prudent Observations, a look into international relations theory and just what on earth is going on in the world. I hope that you are all doing well. I know that the topic might seem a little dour, but there's plenty of things for us to go into, whether it is the literature, whether it is the previous, maybe last 70 some odd years of history, as well as current events going on. So, welcome. I hope that you all enjoyed the new introduction and the waiting music. That way we don't have to worry about people missing things as we get started. And with that, we're going to just open up our lovely little PowerPoint presentation, and we will get started very shortly now, won't we? Let's get to slideshow. Fantastic. So, with that being said, we're going to take a look at, of course, today being the discussion over nuclear weapons, and we'll get right into sort of the outline for our discussion. But that's something that I thought would be rather pertinent for us to talk about, rather prudent, especially in the wake of recent events of course, between Russia and Ukraine, the recent discussion over defending recently annexed territories, claimed territories, over the concern of Russia's nuclear doctrine in regards to sovereign territory. And I was just reading from Michael Tracy this morning that apparently CBS News was talking about American forces doing exercises, and even more recently with terrible blue check saying that living in an American city during a nuclear war is living on the front lines. So I thought that rather than we listen to the miasma of terrible takes and blue check marks, that we would have a discussion on this topic proper. So the outline for today's lecture, of course, is going to be a little bit of a literature review. We're going to go over some articles. We're going to go over some books that I think are rather important for us to know. 2 out of 3 of these texts I can probably get a hold of and publish on a community tab, or of course update the description so you guys can access them, because it's always good for us to own books rather than to just read other people's notes and things. So we'll have that up there. We'll talk about, of course, why nations pursue nuclear weapons, both within the lens of realism and the idea of sovereignty over all else. Regards of nuclear disarmament, I'm going to go a little bit into some postmodern thinking with my boy Paul Virilio. And then, of course, talk about nuclear weapons today with regards to Russia, North Korea, and Israel. I don't think I didn't forget about them. And final thoughts along with today's news before we get to announcements, super chats, and frog of the week. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. So while the world has definitely changed since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, nuclear proliferation had certainly pursued both during the Cold War but also afterwards. As you can tell right here, this is from the Federation of American Scientists. It's sort of to give an update on the global estimated nuclear warhead inventory. I would imagine that this number is much higher, but this is just what we know officially on record. Between India, Pakistan, China, North Korea, Russia, the United States, and other nuclear powers ranging from France, the United Kingdom, and Israel. There were once more interested nuclear states as well as nuclear armed powers, but we'll get into that later in today's lecture. But one thing that you'll notice is a theme about this discussion today in the lecture, as well as really everywhere where you see nuclear weapons being a part of any kind of discourse, whether it's academic, geopolitical, or strategically. A lot of this is built upon the foundations made during the Cold War. And in this post-Cold War era, especially now in 2022 with recent events, that thinking is both foundational, but some are very much questioning whether or not that thinking is outmoded. especially when you're hearing terms like a limited nuclear exchange or the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which still have the potential, of course, to bring about the end of the world as we know it. Now, this leaves room for the unthinkable to happen, both in conflict as well as testing environments. We'll get into the discussion of nuclear accidents, as well as the both authorized and unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. So, we'll talk a little bit about everything today with regards to terrorism, which treaties govern parts of the world, who's still a signatory, and of course, the ongoing issue of the security dilemma. But before we get into all of that, I thought that it would be rather wise for us to be a little read up on the literature. I did spend some time going through my old college notes, as well as reviewing some texts that I had gotten a hold of at a half priced books, which I was really thankful to get a hold of. So we're definitely going to do a pretty good dive into things now. So the first one is going to be from it's called the foundational text. It's called Nuclear Ambitions, the Spread of Nuclear Weapons from 1980 to 1990, or 1989 to 1990, I should say, but it does cover much more than that. So this is a large PDF that was originally funded by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace back in 1991, which was illustrating what the world looked like in the midst of what was presumably going to be a much more cooled, relations between the USSR and the United States of America. As you can tell on this map image here, which if you can't tell or if you're listening by audio, I'll explain in just a second. But it did show rather an interesting world pre 2001 when interventions and preemptive conflict to eliminate nuclear weapons was being included, but as well as that international treaties had really begun to take a hold of things. So you can see on this map to the right, nation states that were interested in nuclear weapons or had the potential to pursue nuclear power ranged from Iran, Israel, Iraq, Brazil, and Argentina, as well as showing Australia had been completely pursuing a policy of no nuclear weapons and really no nuclear energy, to a point where, according to Australian parliamentarians, that the N word means nuclear in Australia, not necessarily the one that we like to make towers of on Twitter behind certain anonymous accounts. So, kind of illustrates the politics of what we've seen out of the Cold War. But those areas of interest I thought that were most particularly interesting, and which is indicative of, I think, of a lot of our foreign policy since 1991, is Brazil, Argentina, and Libya. Libya, we definitely know how that turned out. And in fact, when Muammar Gaddafi was still, the de facto head of the Libyan government and was still in charge, during the time of nuclear disarmament of the Soviet Union, there was one point in time where the nation of Kazakhstan had the fourth largest nuclear arsenal in the world, just by the nature of how the Soviet Union had broken apart and the former Soviet republics had gained independence. Prior to Kazakhstan relinquishing and disarming itself of nuclear weapons, there was diplomatic as well as material communications between Muammar Gaddafi and the Kazakh government about the idea of working together to procure and establish a sort of a Muslim style nuclear energy program, or that for Libya to pursue its own nuclear weapons and deterrence. And we'll look at is the reasons as to why nations pursue nuclear weapons, and Libya will be a prominent case study into that regard. But of course, looking back at the time, both between various governments and military rule between Brazil and Argentina during the 1970s and 80s, there was growing concern that there would be a push in South America to have an expanded nuclear capability, not just in nuclear energy, but also to export uranium. This was long before these nations had, joined a part of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, as well as what we can see in Africa, the Treaty of Pelindaba, which we'll talk about. These treaties essentially procured and created non-nuclear weapon zones in Africa and South America, especially the Treaty of Pelindaba, which had been formally put into effect, I believe, since 2009, was ratified much, much earlier, but it has effectively turned the continent of Africa, much like the Treaty of Tlatelolco, basically to be no nuclear weapons. And also, this document provides us a really interesting understanding of how nations in the past with nuclear arsenals, particularly India, Pakistan, Brazil, and Argentina, would ensure diplomatic cooperation between one another. The literature cites specifically with India and Pakistan that the leadership in India made assurances to Pakistan in 1985 of what is known as a no attack pledge, essentially saying that nuclear material enrichment facilities, places for nuclear power plants, if there were to be, say, a war or a border strike or anything like that, given the risk post Chernobyl, especially as well as 3 Mile Island, that those areas would not be attacked. However, that requires good faith between both parties, that the assumption that the actors are rational, and clear lines of diplomatic communication. Emphasis especially on clear lines of diplomatic communication, because I think what we can tell right now between what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and Western backing of that nation, that diplomatic communication is cut pretty thin. But you can find this PDF online. It's poorly formatted, so it's like 700 some odd pages long. It's really half that length, if not significantly less, especially if you don't want to dig through the footnotes. But this one you can easily access, and I will post a link to it in the description afterwards. And if not, I'll put it on a community tab as well. But it was a neat little text to illustrate what the line of logic was going to be as it entered into the 2000s about how we can increase mutual aid between nuclear powered states, so those that are pursuing more nuclear energy, trying to establish sort of more international frameworks, either through the United Nations or through attaching it. Actually, one of the proposals that was discussed in this article was trying to have it attached through things like the International Monetary Fund as a way to provide financial incentive for nuclear cooperation, both through assistance, material support, but as well as actual researchers and individuals that know how to run nuclear reactors, as well as to promote inspections to ensure that nuclear proliferation, especially in the wake of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, finds its way to ensure the less likelihood of fissile material being in the hands of non-state actors, which had been the growing concern, especially into the 1990s, that, well, as the Cold War draws to its close and it's over, that really the big concern is going to be, where does this fissile material go? Does it go out of the hands? Will it pursue non-state parochial interests? And that's still very much the case to this day, which we'll talk about. But the next one is probably one of my favorite books on the subject, although I would argue it's a little bit dated. This is The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, A Debate Renewed. This was originally published back in the early 1990s. There's been quite a few editions since then. The picture that you see on screen is from the 5th edition, which I believe came out in 2000, either 2003 or 2005. I'd have to check my copy here. 2003. Okay. There's another, the 3rd edition came out in 1995. So this has seen significant updates. I read the 3rd edition in 1995. So this one doesn't discuss what happened between India and Pakistan and their border clashes in the late 90s. But it does significantly talk about the importance of, well, in this age of nation states pursuing nuclear weapons, this sort of info hazard is out and open and available relatively to the world. If you were to study nuclear fusion and how fission operates, that nuclear weapons in an age of bipolarity definitely decreased the likelihood of nuclear war, primarily based on deterrence. And this debate really does go between structural theory of international relations, that we exist in sort of this rules-based, rational order of things internationally, versus, well, really, how do organizations work? How do militaries operate? How do local energy officials operate? And this debate gets pretty intense. So I'm going to go into this book. I have my notes out in front of me from my university days, which is quite some time ago. But Waltz argues, and I should probably preface this, Kenneth N. Waltz is one of the most important thinkers in terms of the realist school of international relations. In 1979, he wrote the book A Theory of International Politics, which established sort of the contemporary neo-realist thinking of the day and age, which he focused more on the defensive side, arguing how nation states operate within the consensus of, where they exist geographically, demographically, military strength, economy, and so on, and how they may interact with other states in a rational position. This stuff would be rather expanded upon by individuals like Kenneth M. Walt, or yeah, no, Stephen M. Walt, and most famously John J. Mearsheimer. Although there are others that still cite Waltz to this day, including Scott Sagan, or others that I frequently cite on here, such as Dr. Fearden or Dr. Mitra. But Scott D. Sagan is both a scholar of nuclear proliferation. He's worked in numerous areas, both in terms of education, but also as being a consulting scholar with the International Atomic Energy Agency. He's been writing about nuclear weapons for a good latter portion now of 30 years. Between these two gentlemen, Sagan is still alive and is still writing. Waltz unfortunately passed away in 2013, a great mind. But the debate really does split between will we see an increased area of regional peace in the world if nuclear weapons spread, or are we going to see things fall apart? Waltz argues primarily that the spread of nuclear weapons can increase the likelihood of regional stability. That what might be seen as radical at home typically doesn't mean you're going to see radicalization abroad. He's primarily citing, of course, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, that despite their rhetoric being rather escalatory, outside of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's been rather decreased likelihood of radical action. Especially when they share borders between each other. And he's referencing, of course, the Sino-Soviet border dispute back in what was it, in the 1980s, right? Is what he was referring to, that both of these nations were nuclear armed states, that still neither of them agreed to, push the button on one another. His primary arguments, of course, is that possession of nuclear arms usually slow arm races down because you now have the ultimate means of deterrence. And of course, states typically, the fears, of course, are that the general fears about nuclear weapon proliferation is that nation states become tyrannical or authoritarian in order to control them, or that nation states may lose them. And in part because internal instability would not lead to nuclear war. The question is, well, where would they aim them at? We've seen this inside, other nations that have had internal disputes before. Most specifically, I think we can also tell this with Iran. Despite nuclear, weapons, they're not pointing them at each other. They're not pointing them at anybody else. They're still relatively in control of their own state. And even if they decided to fire it, Waltz dismisses this primarily being that even if there was an attempt to do so, the international community would be more than likely to engage beforehand. However, Sagan pretty much tears into this in these claims that nuclear weapons and their proliferation is actually not a good idea. He argues that more would be worse, primarily based upon that the complexity of organizations, as well as their very limited and restricted interests and goals, not to mention competing goals and interests, make them actually more likely to create accidents. Primarily because large organizations, whether that's a military structure or say you have civilian control over your nuclear arsenal, it's the reason why the Department of Energy in the United States is so bloody important. There's a great book that talks about this in the United States, and I will pull up the title for you all in a minute. But it discussed the back and forth between military and civilian control over nuclear weapons during the 1960s and 70s. It was a long-standing political debate in the executive branch of government at that time. But Sagan argues primarily that these individuals are always going to respond to incentives. So, there's always going to be the position that the lack of positive civil control means that you're going to see situations where more radical voices are going to be interested, especially those that are, trying to gain favor with the leadership that are in charge. And that current and emerging nuclear proliferations have little or no interest in being engaged with the outside world. Primarily, he had cited at this time, and again, this argument was originally written before the Budapest Memorandum of 1996, that nations like Ukraine and North Korea do not have the most prominent civilian control or diplomatic control over their nuclear arsenal with the international relations. In regards to rational deterrence theory, which we see a lot in nuclear arms discourse, Sagan claims that no preventative war while one state has nuclear weapons and the other is in the process of acquiring them. Both states would have to develop second strike capability, and these arsenals cannot be prone to accidental or unauthorized use, which is why Sagan is very adamant that nuclear proliferation, especially in areas like Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, or other African nations that have pursued nuclear arms in the past or have stated that they would like them, do not have the financial resources, the government infrastructure, and most importantly, the brain power to do so, which we'll talk a little bit about more in the future because there's a rather interesting HBD take that we can look at. But the organizational concerns that he has primarily are based upon a few things. The idea that states act rationally within the international system is a taken for granted assumption. Historically, I think that claim has been very much vindicated. Organizations have very limited rationality. They have limited goals. They cannot always see the larger picture in regards to what their actions are doing by the very nature of how their organizations are structured. There, of course, are always going to be conflicting goals, whether it's the interest of an administration. Militaries, of course, are susceptible to this, whether they want to look for ways to expand national defense to keep the growth of their respective organization, and, of course, their relationship to arms industries and outside countries. Preventative strikes, in this regards, these debates go back and forth. Waltz argues that they wouldn't happen, that they're particularly rare. I will argue that Waltz makes this claim prior to 2007, which we'll talk about. But Sagan argues that, offensive doctrines are usually based, of course, on an organization itself. Nuclear weapons, of course, are no laughing matter, whether, your take on them or whatever. I hope that you're not one in the Martin Webb camp. And even if he's right, I don't want to live to see it be tested. The book, however, is definitely testament, I think, to a debate between, what exists after the newer editions talk about the recent clashes on the border between India and Pakistan, two nuclear armed states that sort of recognized that they can't go all the way and that these border clashes aren't going to get you too far. The difference, of course, is that those are between two individual nation states and not necessarily the situation that we're seeing right now in Ukraine. However, I think that this book is vital reading if you're interested on it. The archive.org has got a place for you to view the book and read the copy yourself. If you want to log in with an email, usually I just use my channel email, Gmail, and it allows you to borrow the book for an hour. And it's probably a good way to probably screenshot it and turn it into a PDF. I'm just saying, if you do that, it's entirely your prerogative. And then the third text that we'll be citing quite often for the rest of this is going to be Going Nuclear, an International Security Reader. This was published in 2010. If you can tell by the picture on the right that this has got my scar on my left arm from my fistula surgery. So yeah, I am not a sued. I do read these things. And if you'd like, even better, I'll just do this real quick so everyone can see it. Here's the text. Really good. And let's see, we'll go back to full screen. And this has a variety of articles that are going to be talking about a variety of chapters that are going to discuss both in regards to why nation states build nuclear weapons, the sources and consequences of nuclear proliferations in Southeast Asia, especially talking about, the Pokhran Treaty that came out between India and Pakistan and their nuclear weapons program, and how to achieve nuclear stability. This, of course, was all, a lot of the articles that were published in here are published before the 2008 standoff between India and Pakistan after the bombings in Mumbai. So this does offer us a limited perspective. However, the literature itself is really good to read, especially, and I'll read a little bit from here because some of it's really good. So in regards to Southeast Asia, in regards to India and Pakistan, there is quite a bit of the history of the origin of India's nuclear program. So, for instance, quote, the Indian nuclear program, in a sense, predates India's independence from the British Empire in 1947. The civilian program can be traced back to the work of Indian physicist Homi J. Bhabha, who had studied the eminent nuclear scientist Lord Ernest Rutherford at Cambridge University in the 1930s. But of course, I argument that they wanted to develop nuclear weapons emerged much later, especially as the Department of Atomic Energy would be later developed in India in 1954. And the development of nuclear weapons at the time did not want to be made public, especially during the time Prime Minister Nehru did not want to have them, primarily on the policy of non-alignment, to distance themselves from the superpower struggle of the United States and the USSR. However, the nuclear infrastructure would be developed, especially by leading scientists, and the discussion about nuclear weapons would come later. That after India and China had a brief war in the early 1960s and 1962, their chief scientists would pursue and dialogue with the United Kingdom over how to develop and procure nuclear weapons. So that's just one part of this that I think is really good for us to take a look at today, and we'll be citing this quite often throughout there. But it talks about, nuclear disarmament, the history of how nations like South Africa and Australia disarmed themselves, and even Scott Sagan is in this text as well, discussing why nuclear weapons are the chief weapon that most emerging states that want to secure themselves on the world stage are what they want to pursue. So, moving along to my notes. So now we have to ask ourselves the very simple question, and Sagan gives us 3 reasons as to why. Why do nations pursue nuclear weapons? The answers might seem obvious. You don't want to get invaded. You want to ensure that nobody messes with you. And if the last 30 some odd years of preventative and quixotic interventions in the Middle East and other parts of the world have been any demonstration, you might want to have the idea of deterrence or to at least be taken somewhat seriously. So, in referring back to that going nuclear text, Sagan offers us 3 reasons as to why nations pursue them. 1 is usually to secure a greater position on the world stage. 2 is to pursue territorial sovereignty. It's why the little Latin phrase about, imperium above all, but also for identity and access to scientific advancement and growth. Sagan's arguments are pretty straightforward here, basically saying that if you are perceived as a smaller or an insecure power, especially with the leadership that is tentatively in control of government, the pursuit of nuclear weapons would allow yourself to not be the subject of conversations of regime change. This is my personal take. This is partially why I think Iran already has the bomb. Because if Iran didn't have the bomb already, then something like Operation Outside the Box probably would have already taken place, which our attempts to do so to limit nuclear development in Iran has primarily been through sanctions and, of course, more espionage and cyber stuff, such as Stuxnet back in 2009, but nothing like what we've seen here in Syria. Territorial sovereignty as well. This most clearly can come in the basis of Israel and their development of nuclear weapons, as well as the Vela incident back in the 1970s. In order to defend one's territorial sovereignty in the face of overwhelming odds, at least numerically, and nations surrounding you in a hostile environment, both diplomatically and militarily. Sagan argues that the pursuit of nuclear weapon development and the ability to have deterrent capability is the primary goal of ensuring territorial sovereignty. And then the third one he argues for, which is the one least cited, but the one that people should always consider, especially when pursuing nuclear energy, not just nuclear weapons, is that this allows for a national identity, both in regards to scientific advancement, to be seen more seriously on the world stage, but also to have access to resources that can come with engaging with the nuclear community, whether that be dealing with the International Atomic Energy Agency, engaging in diplomatic means, and rather increased scientific areas of research that can allow your nation to be seen as a preeminent area of scientific advancement and education. And the same reason why Sagan argues is that developing nuclear powers typically means that it allows you to create ways to defend yourself in regards to overwhelming advantages. He argues about this that the nuclear deterrence argument is a great way to help defend yourself, especially when previous, for instance, in 1967, Israel had to destroy a 2-to-1 Air Force advantage in 1967 within hours. So things that, even if you're lucky and you can have that happen to you, the odds are that, again, a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 air force advantage in regards to your opponents attacking you would allow you to have the ultimate sort of authority of deterrence there. Which has always been sort of the classical claim that this means that large territorial conflicts usually become much smaller. No one's crossing the Rhine, or no one's advancing and marching into Poland or France these days, in part due to nuclear weapons, which is why we're seeing territorial disputes between nuclear powers be over much smaller areas, as Waltz likes to argue, although Sagan claims that has the likelihood of escalation. However, there's also the other argument that this text talks about, and this one comes from a James Potter and a lovely Indian Russian guy that I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, but it's in this text. They argue, it's the political economy, stupid, in reference to Bill Clinton's famous bit. He argues that, of course, that political regimes will always seek legitimacy both internally and externally, especially in states that have had tumultuous government appearances before, whether that's military governments or newly transitioned into democratic states, or those that go the other way and to become more authoritarian or based on military rule, especially in countries that have seen this in the past, whether that is places in South America, or more recently, what we've seen in Pakistan as well as Iran. They argue that you want to seek legitimacy on the international stage if you have the capability and the infrastructure to pursue nuclear power and nuclear weapons. That does increase the likelihood, at least under their argumentation of the literature, that you will be more likely to be taken seriously by world powers and thus treat the regime with more legitimacy, even if that's something that other states don't want to acknowledge. They cite North Korea as a prominent example of this, that the traditional American foreign policy orthodoxy at the time was oriented around not giving into, what the claims of nuclear blackmail or, trying to denuclearize a state. Whereas where you saw Donald Trump kind of like push for denuclearization, which is why I partially think some of this had failed, while at the same time, actually treating Kim Jong-il and that regime with much more legitimacy. The famous crossing over into North Korea. That really could have been, I think, a much more historical moment, but I do think that Bolton and co. kind of screwed the pooch on that one. I don't think you're going to successfully denuclearize North Korea anytime soon, especially not while they're still testing more long-range ballistic missile systems. Even though they can, theoretically hit the U.S. West Coast, you'd also want to strike more regionally at targets of American interests, such as in Japan and other U.S. military naval bases there. But I mean, those are my thoughts. And of course, ascertaining the why, both realistically and academically, remains a key challenge. That's something that we do see a lot throughout this text, especially in the first part, is that a lot of this is going to remain open in theory, because so far the existing, safety experiences of nuclear power and nuclear weapons has been pretty much well managed by both a myriad of options, whether that's the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the two treaties I mentioned earlier, and of course the International Atomic Energy Agency, being taken rather seriously. Both what we can see now in the conflict of Russia allowing them in at that nuclear power plant, or even Iran trying their best to cooperate, although the issues of good faith remains the ultimate question. And that, of course, goes back down to things like the bargaining expectations of conflict that we've talked about on this channel before in previous streams, or, of course, the issue of whether or not you can ascertain actors are acting rationally, which is always the key question. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about, of course, was South Africa, and this is the most interesting example. Unlike Australia, which just more or less renounced nuclear weapons entirely, South Africa had a strong nuclear weapons policy and was pursuing it well up until 1990 and 1991, especially in the movement towards a post-apartheid government. So, in regards to South Africa, which I thought had one of the more interesting articles to read, let me go pull it out. Let's see here. So, yeah. All right. So, South Africa has an interesting relationship to nuclear weapons, and also at the time had an interesting relationship to Israel. We'll talk a little bit about that later when we get to the issue of Israel itself. But in regards to the history of its nuclear weapons program, their regards to South Africa happened in the late 1970s. Uh, Quote, the United States, France, and West Germany halted their considerable trade and collaboration on nuclear energy and science with South Africa in the late 1970s. Although many sanctions cited South Africa's refusal to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty or accept the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards on the Y Plan, they were also driven by broader anti-apartheid campaigns that gained steam after 1976 Soweto uprisings and massacres, in the 1977 prison murder of Steve Biko, leader of the Black Consciousness movement. Although later you'll find out that quite a bit of we'll probably do a stream on this issue in the future, but the geopolitics during the Cold War with regards to bringing down the anti-apartheid government in South Africa has way more of a subversive interest than most people recognize at first. But in 1979, you get the Vela incident, which is alleged to be a joint test between South Africa and Israel in regards to two nuclear weapons. But to continue on, reputational and normative incentives did not militate heavy against a nuclear capability. Pretoria thought that that the nuclear weapons states' NPT advocacy was hypocritical, given their own expanding nuclear arsenals and inconsistent application of sanctions. In confronting international anti-apartheid pressure, some South African officials even saw a nuclear option as a diplomatic shield. When recently asked how South Africa would have used its nuclear arsenal for diplomatic purposes, P.W. Botha had replied that it enabled the country to maintain its self-respect. National Intelligence Service Director General Neil Barnard, though he says it was not involved with the nuclear policy, thought that a psychological deterrent would command respect and leverage for South Africa. According to others, Brigadier Hosier had the grandiose idea about the status that nuclear weapons would bestow on South Africa. Defying foreign pressure on nuclear issues might have also garnered domestic political support from white voters fearful of Pretoria yielding to foreign pressure on apartheid. Kind of backs up the claim that political legitimacy is something that nuclear-armed states want to go for. However, come to the 1990s, and having built nuclear weapons, the exact number remains unknown. I think the claim had been anywhere between 6 to 11. The dismantlement of their nuclear weapons did come into the 1990s. When he had become president in late 1989, F.W. de Klerk had changed their South Africa's nuclear policy. He had formed an ad hoc committee on his cabinet to consider non-proliferation treaty accession, chaired by the newly appointed Minerals and Energy Mission, David de Villiers. He had also included to the foreign minister, the defense minister, and finance minister, and the newly appointed minister of administration and privatization. This experts committee would allow to move forth on nuclear dismantlement, or to disarm and dismantle their nuclear arsenal. In 2017, F.W. de Klerk, in an interview with the New York Times, had denied claims of letting nuclear weapons fall into the hands of a more Black African government. I do think that this gives a Steve Saylor-esque style of clarity, as well as backing up Scott Sagan's claims that newly formed governments and newly forming African, but more especially just more forming nuclear armed states will not have the capacity, the resources, nor the brain power to do so. I know that that's a rather hardcore HBD take on these sort of things, but it does raise the question that if you're more than likely to be encountering something that has the likelihood of, Chernobyl, if not worse kind of styles, or again, operating on the parochial interests of warlords and other ethnic interests, then it is probably for the best that South Africa to this day does not have nuclear weapons. And whether or not F.W. de Klerk denied it or not, I think that was a partial reason as to why. But it was the internal domestic political change that serves as the key factor. South Africa is probably the biggest shining example as to how nation states will disarm their nuclear arsenals outside of the Cold War transition period, especially because it was the internal domestic politics that would let, at the time, legitimate and competent leaders to move in a direction that would disarm themselves and hopefully relieve the rest of the world from potential nuclear weapons use. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about today is probably one of my favorite thinkers of sort of the French school. And this gentleman is the name of Paul Virilio. And he wrote a great book back in 2002, but he's been talking about this for quite a length of a period of time. And, well, no, the stream's still here. We're good. But here, let me go show the camera. He wrote this great book called The Original Accident, although he's been writing about it for quite some time. And the issue, of course, that we're going to talk about is the issue of speed. So, for Virilio's idea on technology and the growth of it, he sort of counters what we would traditionally call Western or the Faustian idea of being technologically optimistic, that the more that we learn, the more that we gain in knowledge, the more that we are capable of being masters of that. However, he makes it very clear, both in The Original Accident and his other works on accelerationism, that no technology can exist without the potential for malfunction, and that he laments the fact that modern scientific infrastructure, whether it's any sort of academy of sciences, whether it's any field of engineering, that there is not an explicit department to study the potential for accidents. So with the invention of the first train is the invention of the first train derailment. The invention of the dirigible leads to an accident or some kind of going up in flames like the Hindenburg. The same thing with aircraft, the same thing with any technology. We create new ways to deal with, morning sickness. We create thalidomide and we get the children for it. And you can kind of say, hey, the same thing is happening today with other certain forms of medication, although I'd argue that's a little more nefarious. Anyways, Virilio refers to this, of course, as the integral accident. All of these things are an integral part to how we develop technology. And so Virilio argues that as nations age and they continue to develop in highly technological societies, the technical, political, and cultural memory fades into worldviews, one, that were both deemed unthinkable, but B, that knowledge becomes lost. In the same way that you can ask yourself the scratch your head kind of question, and you can look this up. I'm not sort of BSing here. The technological difficulties that reside for us to rebuild equipment like the Saturn V rocket. But however, these accidents are not just based on techniques. They are also based on social and rules orders, or social techniques, if you will. Virilio articulates that these kind of accidents lead to what might be called the original or the integral accident that leads to a fundamental change in how society operates, that now that these accidents have taken place, the world is irreparably changed. And in doing so, it puts us in a really, really hard rock in a hard place. So, for instance, the idea protection haunts and takes up the whole life, claimed one of the great exterminators of the 20th century. But this paradoxical claim of the certain Austrian painter forces us to go back to the origins of various expectations horizons, one that had preceded the great accident which ecology today presents as a symptom, whether that's, and in this regard, Virilio is referring to just worldwide ecology in regards to that. Revolutions, whether American and French, were about political upheavals that had no idea of the accidents that would come in the 20th century, or the nihilist revolutions that would come in the mid 20th century. But as Lenin explained, and he would know, revolution is communism plus electricity in regards to how technology can accelerate things or set things off. And so, of course, in doing so, Virilio is articulating that these accidents put us in worldviews that were once considered unthinkable. This is partially why you can see things regarding limited nuclear exchanges, people like Noah Smith articulating that they're on the front lines of nuclear war. And most importantly, that even developed countries can have accidents themselves. The United States has numerous near accidents that were limited by the organizational structures. And of course, learning did result in this. Whether it's, of course, the Arab-Israeli War and the incident in October of 1973, Strategic Air Command's B-52 in Greenland, although that one's not too convincing. And of course, what I have on here is a map of lost nuclear weapons or major nuclear weapons incidents inside the United States, whether it's, of course, the very famous one about a nuclear weapon being lost in some bog in Georgia, or more recently in the issues of uh, nearly having one go off in 2007. So the likelihood, of course, that Virilio argues is that as our social techniques, our amount of information that we consume accelerates, meaning that we are constantly endowed with information that makes it harder to make rational decisions, the more likely human beings are inclined to make an accident. And he says that while Hiroshima is the original accident of this devastating nuclear technology, he argues that it is most likely to come again in a much more devastating form. And we've come close in the past. But I think that this line of logic is just an interesting sort of cautionary accelerationist take. Virilio is not like Nick Land in any way, shape, or form, where Nick's kind of for accelerationism in a way to bring about this new world and this sort of like neo-cameralist technocratic age. Virilio warns you that you can accelerate all you want, but the price that you're going to pay is going to be heavy, near, and dear to you. So I guess that brings us to today's news. And I'll get more to the Israel bit. I didn't forget that. We'll talk about that in a second because they do have a nuclear weapons program. But I'm sure that the question everyone has had on their minds as of late, especially if anyone's been following the news and seeing what's going on, well, what are the odds now that we've had the discussion of nuclear weapons in mainstream media and news discourse, and President Biden, however cognitive he may be, articulating in private fundraisers that the risk of nuclear Armageddon is very real? Not a very settling thing to think about, that we've kind of returned to these Cold War era style of existential dread waning about us, not to mention more recently Kim Jong-il of North Korea testing nuclear weapons over in past the Sea of Japan and having them dip down into the Pacific. It does raise a rather important question. The threat has always been greater than zero, both by nature of a actual accident happening, whether that's Virilio style or just proper mishandling. Doesn't even require nuclear weapons. It can also require meltdowns, power plants, Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. Lord only knows what's going to happen if the power plant that's currently under siege in Ukraine is happening right now. But of course, the odds have always been greater than zero. The betting markets right now have ranged anywhere from 5 to 15%, which is higher than it has ever been in the last 30 years. The current situation and escalation of Russian rhetoric from both Western and Russian leadership indicates a serious concern about existential threats. Now, this was the great thing that had been articulated by quite a few realists, Walt, Mitra, and several others that have talked about nuclear weapons before, back in March and May of this year, that the nuclear weapons policies of today are primarily based upon existential threats. Russia had changed that more recently in the last 15 years. But this also comes from various news agencies had reported that the Russian government said that the newly annexed regions, what they had claimed from the referendums, would fall under the Russian nuclear protection, that an attack on Russian sovereignty and its territory would lead to nuclear retaliation. And today's conflict raises questions about a small war in the face of these kind of threats in between nuclear powers. I don't think you can call this a proxy conflict. The blatant, open propaganda, the blatant and open use of, both from memes and rhetoric about this unabashed support. I mean, there's internal political talk here in the United States about how much to give, and even doesn't matter who takes it in the midterms. I mean, they're already planning to have another $1 billion plus more sent over to Ukraine on top of the tens of billions that have already been sent since this conflict had started from the Congress, and we're paying for it whether we like it or not, both with the threat of nuclear conflict, but also with the taxpayer dollar and this shite economy. But this does raise questions about Waltz's concept of small war. And of course, Waltz's argument is that between nuclear armed states, territorial disputes or the claim for large swaths of territory are going to be limited by defensive alliances, international sanctions, but of course, the concern of nuclear retaliation. And that does put us right now in the position of, we're now dealing with the greatest security dilemma that we've seen since the Cold War. And in part, we've definitely have kicked it up again. And by we, I mean USG. It's not like they represent me. Unfortunately, I live here in that regard. But the issue that I guess comes out of all of this and makes it really difficult sometimes to talk about is just like, well, it is outside of your control. If it happens, that's probably going to be it. Because I do not think that the discussion of a limited or tactical nuclear use um, is an extreme risk to traditional judgment. There had been discussions, of course, and even it's always scary when, like, the people that you really don't like sometimes in politics say things that are just common sense. I mean, even who was it, General Milley, right, of the Joint Chiefs, had said something along the lines of, a long time ago we had said the idea of a limited or a tactical exchange of nuclear weapons. Some thought that that was possible, and we were wise to throw that logic out the window. And now it's back again, and that sort of discussion is currently happening. Even if it were to happen or serve as some kind of deterrent, I think that no matter what would happen next, the balls balls out of your court, and the rest of the world gets to respond in kind. And I don't think we should live to see that be tested, and we should pray that it doesn't. But the odds, of course, are greater than zero. There have been plenty of people that have been showing off the literature and what needs to be done, and ways that which you can mitigate the risk. Say, if you don't live in a major urban area or military base, and here are the things that you could possibly do. But we should be denouncing anybody that says nuclear war is winnable. I mean, we've come very close, both by sheer accident and by the few men that have said otherwise. But yeah, the odds are greater than zero, and we should pray that hopefully it doesn't happen, but it is outside of our control. But before we get to the final thoughts and end of lecture, I did want to bring up the sort of history of Israel's nuclear program, just in part because the United States and other nations have witnessed this take place. And this is why I thought the South Africa connection was the most interesting. So, of course, the Vela incident was an unidentified double flash of light by an American Vela Hotel satellite back in 1979 near Prince Edward's Island in the Indian Ocean, roughly midway between Antarctica and Africa. Many have claimed that this is sort of a joint nuclear test carried out by South Africa and Israel. The previous flashes that have been seen, had detected by Vela's satellites during this time were caused by nuclear weapons tests. Now, of course, Israel has them. Their start date's probably estimated to start at the same time that they had begun as a nation back in 1948. However, the current stockpile is unknown. They are not a party of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which also gives you an interesting question back into there. Um, but they've had quite a bit of things happening in regards to this. So, there had also been quite a bit of shipments of restricted material to Israel back in the 1950s and 60s. This includes chemicals for reprocessing samples of uranium 235 in 1959 and in 1966 from plutonium. This came from the Brits, as well as highly enriched lithium 6, which helps boost the use of hydrogen weapons. So all during the late 1950s and early 1960s did the UK also help bolster it as well. Weapons production, of course, has grown through quite a few places, whether that's from American satellite information and the development of nuclear weapons post Six-Day War as the means of an ultimate deterrent, although we've seen in the past how that's been an issue. And for instance, during the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, a roughly top 20 Jewish nuclear scientists left and reportedly immigrated to Israel, which some have been still working in regards to their nuclear energy and nuclear weapons program. So, things to just keep in mind there. They've got it. They're not an NPT party, and we also have Operation Outside the Box, which I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk about it now. In 2007, there was a Israeli facility or a facility in Syria, which had been claimed to be an area for nuclear weapons production, or at least a nuclear reactor, and was, through U.S. intelligence and flying through Turkish airspace. Israel had carried out an airstrike in there, um, known as Operation Outside the Box. This was the airstrike on what was known as the Al Kibar site, which we had pictured earlier, in the part of eastern Syria, just south of the Rojava region that borders Turkey. Of course, this information had been based upon later investigations in 2009 had been able to confirm, they had reported evidence of uranium being there, but, they weren't able to confirm or deny the nature of the site, because, according to the IAEA, that Syria had failed to give information to them. But the site would be later confirmed as a nuclear reactor during the beginnings of the Syrian civil war, as things really began to take off and go in that direction. And so it does kind of illustrate, I think, a few things here. Preventative strikes are still going to happen, which does illustrate that Waltz's position about, oh, well, if you're going to just do a preventative strike, then you're going to have to eventually conquer that territory or put it into disarray. If not, they're gonna keep doing it again. Which, well, lo and behold, from 2009 onwards, Syria's been a mess internally, both from internal issues, terrorist organizations, American airstrikes, American aid to Kurdish fighters, the trying to oust President Bashar al-Assad. Where you get the famous meme, "Assad must go." All sorts of stuff right there. So the world of preventative war and nuclear strikes are still very much alive and well today. But escalatory rhetoric, of course, has only deepened the modern day security dilemma. Due to the complex nature of alliances, equipment, tensions, and the upkeep of nuclear arsenals, the literature and the theoretical potential applications of nuclear deterrence, as well as how much of that Cold War logic can apply into today's much less bipolar world, raises a certain question of to how much this can actually be useful. And that's the thing about nuclear weapons literature that I have found, that there's always a lot of sort of caveats inside what I was reading through these past couple of weeks, which has been oriented around these are the things that we think could happen under these models, but we do not know because these things have never happened yet. And that always kind of makes it scary. And I'm sure that there are some people out there that kind of do get worried about these things. But I think the saying from Saint Silouan is quite applicable in these parts. Keep thy mind in hell and despair not. There are things, of course, that are well out of our control, but we can do our best today in our day and age to handle with one another with care and to just take care of ourselves. Even if things do hit the fan, I think that it's going to really only be up to what you decide to do and really up to the Lord at that point. But that will be the conclusion of today's lecture. Those are things to keep in mind. And I will definitely get to your guys' stuff here in a little bit. But first, announcements. Well, it's actually changed. Bella Phosphorus Night. They did upgrade from using floppy disk drives to other systems. And since Bill Clinton's administration, there has been what's known as the I think it's called the NPR or something like that with an M. But every new administration gets an updated record of nuclear war and the nuclear weapons infrastructure that the United States has. And these are actually public. So you could look these up if you wanted to. I don't know if Biden's is up yet, but the Trump administration's update on its nuclear infrastructure is available if you'd like. The USG definitely does a really good job at publishing everything that it does. You should really be concerned when the U.S. government stops publishing things, for instance. So, for instance, the United States government had recently announced that they decided to not publish how many arms shipments go to parts of the world in our arms sales. So that's how things get a little weird. But we do have announcements to get to and Frog of the Week, and then I'll get to Super Chats because it looks like you guys sent quite a bit. My eyes have been focused on the book and my book's notes and the PowerPoint. I have not paid attention to chat. My apologies. I will do that, of course, after announcements and Super Chats. But as for announcements, I've got plenty for you. So, for instance, I have been invited to appear on Millennial this year. So sometime coming soon. We'll work out the details, but I will be with Mr. Woes this coming uh, Yuletide festival with the great sort of gathering of just like, rocking around the clock with Millennial Woes and all the great interviews that he does. So that is a great thing I'm very happy to announce. I will be back editing, of course, the titles of the Sunday stream. That way, it will be just known as Prudent Observations from here on out. I'll change the playlist name as well. If you guys don't want that and you want the old ones versus the new, that's perfectly fine. Um, Semyagog and I were talking about doing another like Ukraine bit in the future, but I know Jimmy Thomas just decided to take a step down from his stream appearances and his video work, so he and I are still sort of talking about that. But I think that it is due time for Oliver and I to have a good geopolitical discussion once again. I love doing stuff with him as well as Praise of Folly. I think the three of us do pretty good work together. I recently recorded an interview with the guys over at American Virtue. My buddy David Carlson works there, and he wanted to have me on, so we had a pretty good hour 15 long conversation. I thought that was pretty good. Our friend Disgraced Propagandist, or Isaac Simpson, he hosts the Carousel podcast. You might know him on Substack as the guy that wrote the Civil War in Montana article. I really like his work. He's invited me on. So this Monday, he and I are recording. I will keep you all abreast for when that information comes up. That way you all can view it. And of course, I'll update the Substack that I have with all my list of outside appearances. And then, of course, this week's Digital Archipelago episode will be on my channel with Geo. I really have liked how well that's gone on. The viewership has been fantastic, both on his channel and mine. And you guys do a really good job at keeping it entertaining. I think we do a good. We play off each other pretty well. We'll be leaning into something spooky since it's the season. I don't do Halloween personally, but I'm a big sucker for horror movies and things like that. And I sent Geo a bunch of stuff to look into. So I think it'll be a rather good time. And then the week after is we're going to have Praise of Folly on to talk about H.P. Lovecraft. So keeping in with that horror theme, both the week before and the week after Halloween for you guys. And then I'm going to have a couple of patron exclusive Substack articles out pretty soon on stuff from my book that I'm currently writing, as well as some, rank punditry essays and things like that. So I spent quite a bit of time writing, and those will hopefully be finished soon. So patrons will have access to that. So if you want to see exclusive videos of me just tearing into foreign affairs articles or just things that you might see in my essay collection that will be hopefully out this coming spring, it will be out very soon. But those are my announcements for now. I'm not too sure I've got too much going on. Let me see here. But with that, I think it's just time for Frog of the Week. All right. So this week's Frog of the Week is the gladiator tree frog. One of the largest tree frog species on record, can get up to about 3.5 inches in length. You can find it in the lowlands of Ecuador, Argentina, as well as other parts of Central and South America, as well as Panama and Costa Rica. And so, the name itself doesn't seem to be all that interesting. Well, how does this little guy, get the impression of a gladiator? Well, on his webbed hands up there in the front, he's got a dagger-like protrusion to both dig, but primarily to hunt and for self-defense and to ward off those that might attack the nest. Both males and females have it. While it does have a short lifespan of 1 year, they do an incredibly good job at breeding and developing rather quickly. Once the eggs are fertilized, they will crawl up and join their froggy brethren within 40 hours, so less than 2 days. And they will usually breed in muddy pool areas around bodies of water, so not necessarily inside the ponds or streams themselves, but in the muddy areas near the shoreline or just where it's very moist and wet around them to have the eggs buried and then develop. And that is the gladiator tree frog. There's actually quite a few of them. There are like 95 specific species within this family. But, I thought that these guys were pretty interesting, that these small little dudes with, got their daggers ready, like Assassin's Creed style. And that is this week's frog of the week, ladies and gentlemen. So we will go back to these frogs just in time every week. That's definitely what happens. So here we go. So I'm just going to catch up with all the super chats that happened in here. Let's take a look here. But first, I have to thank my top tier patrons that donate $20 or more a month or more on Subscribestar. Fearless Leader, Raging Mandrill, User 4A5BD5DB5, Cowering Bugman, Winston Fujimori, Hunger, Consumer, Focron, and Preservatism. You guys make it all worthwhile. I'm going to be updating the stuff soon, and I'll be adding a few more tiers as well for support. That way, I can send some stuff to you guys if you wish via email and things like that. I'm also on Buy Me a Coffee, and then I'm going to be rearranging my computer setup actually rather soon. That way we can talk about, doing things like entropy and working through OBS. That way I'm not running off of my laptop and things like that. So things will be changing relatively shortly. But your ongoing support means a lot to me, and I'm very thankful that you guys make this rather crappy economy and the cost of medication all that more affordable and manageable, and I'm very thankful for it. So with that, I'm going to put that to the side here, and we'll do this actually. Hold on. See if I can do it this way. Cool. I'll turn on my camera, and we'll just go through. Of course, an Ecuadorian frog would stab you. Well, when in South America, right? Do as the South Americans do. So let's take a look. I have to now scroll. I want to show them on screen, so I'm going to just scroll through chat and try and find the beginning. Okay, cool. We're at the top. That way I can just scroll through. Minoan for $10 US says, please break your 3-day rule and make rash comments about Hu Jintao. So yeah, normally I follow AA's discussion of a 3-day or 5-day rule about when breaking news events happen before talking about them. I did see the theatrics at the party congress today within China. I saw all the photos and the video of him being dragged out, and just Xi Jinping looking at the former guy, just sort of with this almost a smirk, really. To me, it does seem like a rather impressive flex of power, especially after a couple of weeks ago, you had Indian Twitter trending about some sort of Chinese coup. So whatever the hell is happening inside Beijing, to me, it certainly shows that Xi Jinping is not going anywhere anytime soon, but definitely had some theatrics to it. So there's my initial take. I'm not as big of a China insider as the other guys out there, but those are things to definitely keep in mind. Hunger the Die Merchant for $5 says, can you speak on the Saudi-Pakistan alliance, i.e. Saudi Arabia uses Pakistan's nukes as leverage and balancing against Iran's nuclear program? Yeah, sure, I can talk about it for a little bit. I remember a few years ago as well that Saudi Arabia was actually willing to purchase nuclear weapons, or at least procure the fissile material to develop them themselves from Pakistan. Traditionally and historically, you're absolutely correct, Hunger, that Saudi Arabia has relied on Pakistan's relationship with regards to their nuclear weapons as sort of a counterbalance to Iran and their own issues. But I think that with Saudi Arabia, especially now for the last several years, wanting to develop their own nuclear weapons program or their own project to do so, I think illustrates maybe a change in position on that, especially now as the relationship with Iran cools between Iran and China, and Pakistan is a part of the Chinese, Pakistan economic corridor. I could imagine that in the foreseeable future that this relationship might deteriorate, at least on paper, but only time will tell. I do think, however, that the Saudi-Pakistan alliance here with regards to nuclear weapons isn't going to go away, but it'll be interesting to see how China develops their relationship and balance it out between Iran and Pakistan, because last I checked, right, the Saudis and Iranians are still going at it in Yemen, and they're still looking at how to, outflank each other when it comes to oil exports in the Strait of Hormuz. What's been one of the interesting things that Semyagog and I have talked about is that, well, if you can get Afghanistan on board, you've got a clear line between China, Pakistan, Afghanistan to Iran, and then you can kind of start exporting oil or get access to that part of the Middle East and the sea without necessarily having to deal with sort of the U.S. Navy and the Saudis as well. So at least for right now, that's been the traditional alliance between the two, has been a nuclear counterbalance. But I think that Saudi Arabia, whether we know about it or not, I think that they're still going to pursue nuclear weapons in the future. Let's see, moving down the line. Art Bandit for $20 US. Wow, thank you so much. I love your geopolitics streams, and I've watched for a while, so you can imagine my surprise when I was watching a War Thunder shitpost video and saw a comment featured in your Trulies. What vehicles or countries interest you? So yeah, for those of you who don't know, War Thunder is sort of my one video game to kill time where I will stress myself out because I just want to fly prop planes. I primarily will fly either the Soviets or the Americans. But yeah, there was, I don't remember which video it was, but they had commented saying, what's the worst advice you could give? And I had said, commit to the head on if you're like if you're a crappy aircraft or whatever. And I guess that comment got featured, which that kind of makes me laugh. But people will comment. I'll comment everywhere. Like I comment on Red Letter Media videos, and people will be like, well, "What the hell are you doing here?" or whatever. So, but that's pretty funny. That's that's great. But thank you, Art Bandit. I greatly appreciate it. I primarily will. It's between Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United States are the three countries that I definitely do. I only play it for the aircraft. I like the idea I can sit myself in a cockpit, and it's not like DCS or anything where I have to be playing it like a an actual flight sim. It's rather accessible. But that's pretty funny. Let's see here, scrolling through. Here we go. Prince of Parma. I should probably look up what currency that is so I don't totally butcher it. CAR. South African Rand. Okay, well, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. You had said, let me hold on. Let me go pull it up now, if it'll let me. There we go. In the spirit of the stream, the boys and I played Catan with nuclear weapons, a variation of our own creation. 3 settlements were destroyed. Well, there you go. I'm quite a fan of that. I like Catan. I also like Diplomacy, and if I really wanted to waste a weekend back when I had more gaming friends out here, it's a little harder to organize a game. But 4th edition Twilight Imperium, I have that sitting in a box somewhere that I would like to pull out again and play. If you want to have a good time ruining friendships, you don't play Monopoly, you don't play Risk, you play Catan, and you go play Twilight Imperium. But hey, if only 3 settlements were destroyed, that's not bad. According to Catan, a limited nuclear exchange is possible, kids. Money and tech can solve everything. Well, not everything. Can't throw money at all the things. Cringewalker for $10 US says, some tech developed in low culture eras can be adapted to high culture eras. Other tech from high culture eras is incompatible with low culture eras. Nukes are sadly the latter. Pray. Yeah, this is why I'm kind of happy that there's some parts of the world that don't have them. So yeah, nuclear weapons and incredibly high advanced avionics equipment is something. It's like Greer's concept of catabolic collapse. That these highly advanced, high culture, high technology systems do not have the capacity to work in areas of low culture or lower areas of intelligence. So, and as IQ drops and our ability to maintain these effective systems, just look at Jackson, Mississippi, for example, that the risk of accident does increase, or at least the state of disrepair. So maybe Virilio will be vindicated in the long run, and even then, that's pretty terrifying. But let's see. Oh, there's one more. Well, there you go. Someone was going to chime in there real quick. Spasticus Autisticus. I still love the name for £2. The NSA hired Kubrick to fake. Well, that would be great to make that claim, but the NSA, when was the NSA created? Real question here. Intel Agency, when were they founded? Yeah, well, they were founded in 1952. Trinity test took place in 1945, so But I mean, unless you wanted to say OSS, that would have been more believable on the face of things. But sure, let's go with that. But yeah, no. Cowering bug. I've thought we have the greatest patrons. We've got the greatest patrons. That's if with names like Cowering Bugman or Milk Appreciator, it's certainly a good bit there. The trick to Monopoly is to cause a housing shortage, says Speedrunner. I bet you that's probably true. Monopoly with nukes sounds fun as well. I don't know how you would incorporate that unless it was like, instead of go to prison or you just, your rental properties have been devastated by an H bomb. Who knows? Yeah. And there are a couple of there's a channel called Frog Eat where they just put a, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like an African bullfrog, and all of a sudden, it'll eat anything that they put in there because it's like the largest frog that still lives. So yeah. And no cool chickens. It was not a Seth vid. I think the guy's name was Tankenstein, but yeah, he had posted some meme like post your worst advice ever, and I threw my comment in there, and I didn't think that would have been, something to be. I didn't think it would be put in there. I'll comment in a lot of places of like normie stuff that I watch or video game things that I watch, and I always get a surprise when people like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" It's like a weird form of making it like, what is this weird right wing e-personalities doing on this random? Well, I like regular shit sometimes, So as we wrap up though with today's chat, do let me know, of course, in the comments if if you like this time frame. I'd like to stick to it because I'd like to have my Sundays off. As I said in sort of my announcements and AMA stream, that I definitely want to be having my Sundays off. I don't want to rush home from sort of our post liturgy coffee and lunch hour to head on over to here and give a lecture sort of rushed or half cocked. Here I can do more proper research, cite the literature and things like that. So I hope that you all enjoy the new time frame and time zone. You get turn up in the morning. You've got me here, and I think Oren McIntyre might be live later, but it all works out. So time of day is good for Europe. Well, that's good because I've learned that half of my audience is not American. It's more or less a 50-50 split between the U.S. and the rest of the world. So I'm glad that this does work out for our European friends. So I greatly appreciate it. And I see so many familiar names and faces in chat nowadays, which is even more welcoming. So things are doing great, But with that, I will see you all on Thursday live on this here on my channel for the Digital Archipelago. We will be live Saturday, of course, continuing on with some geopolitical things. We're probably going to go a little more into some books that I've been reading. I've been back on the book binge. It's not just I've got all my religious reading that I'm still doing, but I've also picked up on some more international stuff as well, or international relations books as well that we'll be going into. And then, the other thing I didn't announce, patrons have already seen it, but now that the U.S. event book has come out, I'm going to do what AA, or not what AA did, but with Radical Liberation did. He had his wife's talk put up there, and a few other people. I know Panama Hat has had his speech from the last year's UK event be available. So my speech that was given at the February event, I will have out very soon. Not this week, but the next. And then there'll probably be a real talk sometime in the future, along with a little video sort of channel introduction of what I am and what I do, which will be, scripted videos, the unscripted real talks, and then the weekly international relations show and things like that. So those will be some interesting things that I've got in the future. But my U.S. event talk stream, which I gave on a little note card, impromptu. I did not write my speech, so you have to thank all of the guys if you bought your event book for transcribing that for me. They did fantastic work. It'll be available for you all to see very soon. I have the video ready to go. I just need to upload it. But with that, ladies and gents, I hope that you all have a very good rest of your Saturday, whether it's the evening, the morning, or the afternoon for you all. I will see you all later this week on the Digital Archipelago, and I'll see you all next Saturday, same time at 1 p.m. Eastern. Take care, everybody, and God bless.